We've called this series Meeting Our Moment. And so wherever you are, I hope you'll enjoy meeting these remarkable people and meeting our moment through them. Hannah Rose Thomas is an English artist with a degree in Arabic and History from Durham University and an MA from the Prince's School of Traditional Art in London. While living in Jordan as a student of Arabic, she found herself organising art projects with Syrian refugees. This led her to seek ways of combining her artistic skills with her humanitarian passion. She began painting portraits of refugees to draw attention to the people behind the global crisis. Since then, the portraits have been shown in many venues, including the Houses of Parliament, the European Parliament, the Scottish Parliament, and Lambeth Palace. 3 of her paintings of Yazidi women were chosen by the Prince of Wales for an exhibition in Buckingham Palace. She was selected as one of the Forbes 30 Under 30 in 2019, and the following year was a nominee for the World Humanitarian Forum Youth Changemaker Award. She writes, "Through my paintings of refugees, I seek to convey that each of us is created in the image of God and equally valuable in his eyes, regardless of race, religion, economic circumstance, or social status." But when did you start painting? Because that's not been all of your life, has it?
No, well, I have always painted since I was little. I've always loved painting, but I think my interest in portraiture and being an artist only really came about as a result of my time doing humanitarian projects in the Middle East and also Africa. I was only out there as an Arabic student, really, so I'd been studying Arabic for 7 months, and then I was invited by the UN Refugee Agency to organise art projects with Syrian refugees for an exhibition on World Refugee Day in Amman, which is the capital of Jordan. So we turned UNHCR refugee tents and as a powerful symbol of displacement into beautiful works of art with groups of Syrian refugee children. But at the time, I was only 22, so I was quite overwhelmed at that opportunity to be given this opportunity to use art in this way. I'd only ever done small paintings, let alone organising a large-scale art project in a foreign language, and saw the potential of how art can be used both as a tool for advocacy, but also for trauma healing, for raising awareness. So really, it was transformative.
In 2017, you went to northern Iraq, is that right, to the Yazidi people? Could you tell us something about the situation, what these women had been through?
Yeah, so I was working with a group of Yazidi women who'd escaped ISIS captivity. So many of them had been sold into slavery to ISIS soldiers before they'd escaped captivity. I was working at a rehabilitation centre, Durham, in Iraqi Kurdistan. So the whole focus of the centre was for trauma healing for the women. There was about 8 women and their children who were there as part of the project. So I taught them how to paint their self-portraits. And I was there with a clinical psychologist, a friend of mine, who was there to record their stories. So the idea was through their self-portraits that we would bring these paintings back into the UK with their stories as a way to share their stories, for them to empower their voices to be heard.
How did you go about teaching people?
I think creativity is innate in all of us, but I just do it step by step. So for the Yazidi and the Nigerian women that I was teaching to paint their self-portraits as a way to share their stories with the rest of the world, we started doing drawing on paper, and they grew in confidence slowly. And I think it's a lot of encouragement. So you really encourage them on their journey, and the way their faces light up when you're encouraging of them as they're growing in confidence and drawing. And then they transferred these drawings onto canvas. So you start with one colour at a time. That's what I learned, particularly with the UNHCR art project, which was with about 30 Syrian refugees at a time, quite young. I would give each child one colour.
And were you surprised at what came back or what came out of this?
Oh, yes, so much so. The portraits that the Yazidi women created and the Nigerian women, they were amazed at the work that they created and so proud of it as well by the end of our time together, because they'd never painted before, so it was a real boost in confidence for them as well. The women also asked me if I would paint their portraits too. The fact that they asked if I would paint their portraits felt like an incredible honour to be entrusted with their stories in that way, because they understood that their self-portraits were going to be shown with their stories to give them a voice in places like, I hoped they'd be shown in the House of Parliament. At that time, I didn't know they would be.
The use of art in the healing process, whether of trauma or of anything else, is well documented. But what is it about art that you can't do with words? I suppose that's the question almost bound to come up.
I think we have, perhaps in the West, come to think of hurt and trauma as lodged in our cognitive memory. But I think a lot of the time it is in the emotional memory as well, which is harder to access. And that's why I think the creative arts, whether that's painting or dance or drama or music, all these ways are a way to build a bridge between the heart and the mind. The reason why the projects with the Yazidi women and the Nigerian women were so powerful was because it created a safe space also for the women to be able to share their stories.
Yes.
But I think, and the process of telling our stories helps us to integrate traumatic memories and to gradually be able to heal and reclaim our dignity. Yeah. But sometimes, I think for survivors of human rights violations, everyday verbal language is just inadequate to convey the depth of the trauma and the depth of the emotions that they have experienced. So the arts can be a really powerful tool to help unlock this process. One of the primary needs of survivors of violation and violence is to feel like a person again, and rediscover their sense of personhood and voice.
Yeah.
And the hope was that these art projects would enable the women to do that.
There are capacities in the arts which we're really probably only just beginning to discover. So that business of rehumanization, I think, is a wonderful a wonderful way. The people you paint, the figures, the faces are wonderfully human. When you started this work, did you sense any resonances between your Christian faith and the way the work was developing? Obviously, you were faced with some very traumatic situations. So presuming there was something of the strength of faith in the midst of those situations. But in what ways do those connections become apparent, if they did?
I think for me, before I began these projects, I'd been on my own journey through post-traumatic stress and so disorder, PTSD. So that experience was very much like, it was like a dark night of the soul kind of experience. And that part of my healing journey was through art. So through painting was how I learned to find my voice again, and to communicate something of what I've experienced as well, and to process some of that. But I came to know God in such a deep way that I don't think I would have come to know him otherwise. And I don't think I would have become an artist coming through that journey. I remember this is what I said to the Nigerian women I was working with. I said that if I hadn't been through that, then I wouldn't be with them today doing this work, which feels like an incredible privilege to do.
Terrific.
Because of my experience, although my experience by no means compares to what the trauma that these women have suffered.
Yeah. Hannah, let's take a little break and have a look at the portrait to your right and to our left. Say something about that.
This painting was the first ever portrait I did, and that was after I came back from time in Mozambique. I asked her if I could take this photo of her, and I was so struck by her dignity and but also her radiance and joy in the midst of such poverty. And when I came back, I found I kind of immersed myself through myself into this painting. I never painted anything that large before, so I was 18. And this painting is it's the largest painting I've done, because I wanted to capture something of the extraordinary vibrancy of the people that I'd met out there in Mozambique. That I felt that my life was deeply enriched. This is a painting of Syrian refugee woman I met in Zaatari refugee camp in Jordan while I was organising the art projects for the UN Refugee Agency. But it's her eyes, which I found were so haunting.
Absolutely.
The depth of emotion in her eyes made me just, when I first met her, think, goodness, what has she seen? What has she been through? But when you're hearing these stories, and that was so. These paintings almost, for me, I found when I returned from these places, whether it was Mozambique or from Jordan, I needed a way to process these experiences that have been overwhelming, as well as the
Yeah.
people that I'd met as well, and
Yeah.
their stories. So the paintings were a way in which to do that, really.
Anna, you've spoken someplace about challenging some of the assumptions that the media particularly have about victims of violence.
Yeah.
Now, what do you mean that? Because we do hear a lot about victims of violence, but there's a certain way in which they're portrayed I think you would feel uncomfortable with, am I right?
I think this was specifically in the context of the Yazidi women. So the Yazidi women I found in the media, they were always presented through this lens of violence and victimhood.
Yeah.
The concept of ISIS sex slaves, which is so other and very difficult to relate to. And this was very different from my experience with the women and hearing their stories. That wasn't what they spoke about. They didn't speak of their experience in captivity and the sexual assault so much as the grief for the loved ones lost, or still in captivity, this anguish of mothers whose children were still in ISIS hands and they do not know whether they will ever be reunited.
For these portraits, I have chosen to use the sacred imagery and techniques that were used for paintings with the Virgin Mary in the early Renaissance. This is because Mary, like these Yazidi women, knew what it was to be poor, oppressed, and a refugee.
The purpose of these paintings were for those who are devotional to Mary or to Jesus to enter into the suffering of Jesus on the cross through Virgin Mary's pain and anguish
Yes.
at the loss of her beloved son. So I do feel that the beauty that I see in each individual that I paint is a reflection of, I guess, we're all made in the image of God. And so I find that there is such beauty in each and every individual. That is something I try to capture in these paintings, even though the sort of stories are heartbreaking as well. So there's deep grief and anguish in these portraits as well. But there is such deep beauty as well. And that is something I always, because for my paintings, I find it's a way almost I pour out my heart as a lament before God. The suffering of these women or others that I've met and had the privilege of working with and honor of hearing their stories.
The beauty of love, the self-giving of love to the very end, which is, as in God in Christ, is itself the kind of ultimate beauty, rather than just a beautiful form to look at. And that what we're seeing in you, an artist, in your work, in the people that you're painting, is a great deal of that self-giving love. We're here, Hannah, in the midst, of course, of a horrendous global pandemic. And I would guess that many that you know best through your art will have been amongst the most cruelly affected, indeed afflicted. As an artist of faith, what do you think? Can you say something about what you see the role of the artist in our current situation? Just some reflections on that.
Yeah, like you said, like those who I've worked with are definitely among the most vulnerable affected by the pandemic. And with being in refugee camps, maybe not having access to adequate healthcare, it's very different from what our experience in the West as well. But I think all across the world, we are going through this experience of the global pandemic, which is quite universalizing in many ways, or equalizing.
Yes.
Going through this together in this. But also, I'm very aware that in this climate of fear and uncertainty, it's very easy to become isolationist or introspective and not to remember the suffering of others around the world. So I think it's really important to perhaps the role of the artist can help with keeping that perspective on others, or perhaps bringing a voice of hope. because with all exhibitions cancelled and for me all projects have been cancelled, so it's felt hard to know what I can do in this midst of all that's going on as well. I know as an artist, I know other friends of mine in the creative arts are struggling with that as well.
You have both lived and worked in countries torn apart by one form of, let's say, racial conflict, racial division, or another. And I realize every place is different. Have you explored at all what the visual arts, or indeed any other form of art, can do to help us address those divisions, those conflicts, those when we tear each other apart?
I think the creative arts can be a really powerful way to speak out against injustice, because it can really touch the emotional core of what moves us towards social justice and compassion, in ways that maybe the news or politics doesn't. And they can affirm a language of empathy as well, having to bridge those cultural and relational divides, and enabling us to find a way to understand those who are different from us as well, and to hear their stories, and to express something of our shared humanity as well. A reminder that we have more in common than what divides us.
Yes, yeah,
is so important. But I think the role of the arts can be used as a tool to transform negative cultural and social norms and contribute to peace and reconciliation efforts as well, through the use of, this is something that I'm hoping to learn more about, really, how the role of the arts in this capacity.
I think it's extraordinarily significant, and there are a lot of, as you find, a lot of studies and a lot of literature now, which does explore that. There's a wonderful quote I often use in this collection. It's from a cellist in the East-West Divan Orchestra, which is Israeli and Palestinians basically playing together at a very high level under Daniel Barenboim. And one of the cellists said, "It's quite hard to demonize someone you've just played Tchaikovsky with." Which is actually pretty good, I think. In other words, it's not that it solves world peace, it solves the problems of world peace, but it enables a different kind of conversation and a different way of speaking to each other, and of treating each other as well. And I'm sure that's the case also with the visual art in some of the ways that you've been speaking about. Hannah, it's been a delight to meet you and to hear of your work. We'll certainly be in touch again. But in the meantime, thank you very much indeed for giving us of your time, and very best wishes for your work in the future.
Thank you very much.